Good evening. I'm Janet Harris, President of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. This evening, we're going to be talking about U.S. China relations. And to introduce our speakers this evening, I'd like to introduce Dr. Betty Tansing.
Thank you, Janet. We are drawing to a close our Great Decisions Program year. This is our second to last of the series. And for those of you who've been following this, we were just commenting before coming on board how the topics have been in alignment with what is timely and urgent going on in the world right now, global affairs. These topics are chosen by the Foreign Policy Association. We only get them in the summer, so they're chosen even well before the summer, and no one could really have predicted what was going to happen. So it's really been amazing. And this evening's topic is no less timely and urgent. We have a wonderful expertise this evening, and we're thrilled to have both Dr. Gallagher and Dr. Soon with us this evening. Dr. Mary Gallagher is a professor of global affairs and dean at the Maryland Keough Dean of Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She previously directed the International Institute at the University of Michigan, where she was also the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Chair in Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights. She has published extensively, so extensively I cannot name you all of her books, but I think what's impressive is they've all been published by distinguished university presses of Princeton, Cambridge, and Cornell, in addition to numerous articles. She earned her PhD in politics from Princeton University and a BA in government and East Asian studies from Smith College. Her extensive international experience includes teaching at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing and visiting professorships at East China University of Politics and Law in Shanghai and the Koguan School of Law at Shanghai Yaotong University. She's received multiple honors for her research, including 2 Fulbrights and a grant from the National Science Foundation and the Luce Foundation. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, a member of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and a consultant for the World Bank, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Department of Labor, and many other NGO and international organizations. Now, normally we would have a moderator and say this would be a moderated discussion. We do have a moderator who's also as distinguished as Dr. Gallagher, and they're going to have a conversation. So I would like to introduce also Dr. Young Soon, who is a senior fellow and director of the China program at the Stimson Center, which is a nonprofit to nonpartisan U.S. think tank that is based in Washington, D.C., that analyzes issues related to global peace. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. Dr. Soon is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, jointly appointed by the Foreign Policy Program and Global Development Program, where she focused on Chinese national security, decision-making processes, and the China-Africa relations. She's a China analyst for International Crisis Group, which is based in Beijing, specializing in China's foreign policy toward conflict countries and the developing world. She earned her PhD from Johns Hopkins and is listed in the Public Intellectuals Program Fellow Database, which is a directory of Chinese experts and specialists to increase America's understanding of China. And I'm very happy to have you both begin your conversation this evening.
Well, thank you so much, Betty. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a true honor to be here, especially with a distinguished colleague like Mary. So really enjoy this opportunity to have a conversation about where China is and where U.S.-China relationship is. Well, Mary, you have done a lot of work on China domestic development and China's foreign relations. I think since the inauguration of the second Trump administration, one of the issues that has captured everyone's attention is this return or the resurge of the trade war. And we have seen that Washington basically imposing reciprocal tariffs against the whole world, right? Claiming that we are gaining more income from and more revenue from the tariffs that we're collecting. So in terms of the U.S.-China relations, despite Washington's claim that the trade war and the tariff war is all for the benefit of American people. Where do you think that we are in that great war of trade or great war of tariff?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm really honored and happy to be here to talk about China and U.S. China relations. I'm based in Indiana, like many of you are, I believe. And I think it's a really interesting time to think about how U.S. China relations also affect the upper Midwest, automotive supply chains, manufacturing, reshoring industry back to the United States. So, I mean, my sense of the trade war, which started in 2018, and I think really had China on the back foot initially. China has learned quite a lot since 2018, and part of that was particularly during COVID, when a lot of supply chains were shut down and a lot of countries had to sort of go back to thinking about more resilient and self-reliant supply chains. China was, I think, very adamant about studying how to become more independent from global supply chains, less dependent on them, even for their own manufacturing, although that's not completely solved yet. I think what's critical about the trade war now, and I've argued this in writing publicly, is that the United States has so far lost the trade war, partially because China this past year was willing to use critical minerals or rare earth minerals as a weapon to demonstrate to the United States as well as to the Europeans and to the Japanese and the Koreans that China holds kind of the ace card in terms of really batting down retaliations and high tariffs. So I don't know what the effective tariff rate is right now on Chinese goods. I think it's much lower than it was, and in some cases is lower than the tariff rates on some key allies. And that's largely because China has been able to use the threat of a rare earths export ban to really dissuade Donald Trump from continuing with very, very high tariffs on China. And there's a longer story going all the way back to Liberation Day and what happened last year. But my sense is that the U.S. now is in a kind of defensive posture and is trying to use time to become better positioned to deal with China's superiority in this regard. And I'm happy to talk more about why rare earths are so important, not just for high level advanced manufacturing, but for even very basic inputs into, say, automotive manufacturing.
Absolutely. I think the Chinese have nicknamed rare earths as a trump card, right? Trump card against Trump. And it evidently played a very effective role in the escalation of the tariff war last year. And this is also quite surprising, I think, for a number of people inside the government, because the assumption of the U.S. policymaking on China, especially in terms of trade, is, well, Chinese economy is so dependent on export.
Yeah.
They're the world factory, and if you're the world factory, you need people to buy your products in order to keep yourself afloat, right? That's the business model. So what do you think that went wrong in that calculus? Because, well, we're in a free market capitalist economy. We do see that the clients are very important. The customers are very important. And the customers should hold more leverage over the producers in this case, right? And like you said, back in 2018, when the trade war first started under the first Trump administration, the Chinese immediately felt the effect of the tariff, and it put the Chinese economic growth in an extremely difficult position. I think for the second Trump administration, they came into office with that same assumption that if we increase the tariff, the Chinese are going to fold. The Chinese cannot afford, they are already having an economic slowdown. They cannot afford losing US as their single largest, trade surplus or origin of trade surplus. So I think that's a reasonable assumption that if you just look at the basic 101 of the bilateral economic relations, what went wrong with that assumption? How did China somehow came up on top?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to ask Yin some questions too. So
Oh,
don't worry. It's
okay.
not
All
just
right.
going to
I'll
be
be
a
prepared.
one. No, no, no. Yeah, yeah. But so this is a super important question. I think that um, China was able to do a couple of different things. And it's not clear to me how exactly they did it or how it was communicated to the American government. But if you think about China as the world manufacturing superpower, and right now over 30% of all manufacturing output comes from China, and that's expected to go up to 40% by 2030, so just a few years away. So and I don't actually, it's possible that the US maybe after World War II reached a similar level, although I'm not sure it ever reached this level of dominance. And so one thing that happens when the United States tries to use the threat of high tariffs on Chinese exports against China is that the United States has to consider a couple of things. It has to consider really mass shortages in the United States for consumer goods, and it also has to consider inflation. And I think those are two things that really terrified Donald Trump and his administration because so many, if you think about the things you consume on a daily basis, and I always look to see where things are made, there are still many things that we consume, less so now clothing, less so now um, textiles and some lower level household goods. But if you look at things like consumer electronics, if you look at things at like more high end consumer electronics, televisions, for example, um, of course, things like iPhones and computers, they are still going to predominantly be made in China. And I think that the threat of really high tariffs on Chinese goods was going to be it was going to blow back against Donald Trump in terms of shortages as well as higher inflation. And those are things that we experienced during COVID. And of course, he knows that made voters very, very unhappy. The other thing that China's done with the rare earth minerals threat, the threat of a ban, is that the high end manufacturing, if we're talking about semiconductors, if we're talking about military weapons, and I think that's a really key issue to think about now in the context of the war in the Middle East and the really rapid depletion of American munitions. How can the United States survive if it doesn't have access to the rare earth minerals and critical minerals that China it mines some of those, but more importantly, China controls 80 to 90% of the processing of those minerals. So I think the Chinese have really studied all of the areas of weakness. They're much better prepared for a trade war this round. But Dr. Sin, I'd love to know what you think about this issue.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote an article last year for Foreign Affairs on exactly how the Chinese turn it around. I think, like your analysis pointed out, that there's a supply shock and then there's a demand shock, right? So when we impose a higher tariff on the Chinese products, we're suppressing the supply to the U.S. market, but the U.S. demand has remained constant. So if you think about it, like for our average consumer here in the United States, every year we pretty much needs very similar things. So like in the spring, we need summer supplies, swimming suits, umbrellas, and say things that you use for the summer vacations. And then by summer, we need school supplies. Kids are going back to school, and we need a massive amount of consumer goods. And then by the fall season, we need holiday supplies. That's Christmas trees, that's toys, that's the gifts we send our families. So these demands are pretty consistent across the year. But when you look at the tariff that when we imposed, it's a 40%, I think it was more than 40%, 140% tariff on the Chinese goods, we immediately kills the Chinese export to the US market. And we don't
Mhm.
have an alternative source of those consumer goods from anywhere else in the world. So
Mhm.
very quickly, well, we've seen that Amazon basically increasing the price because the supply has become so limited. And retailers like Targets or Walmart start to have problems because they no longer have those supplies coming in from China. And I always joke that for anything that involves public opinion, China is going to win because in the US we have a democracy and public opinion is pretty directly reflected in the popularity in the approval rating of the administration. But in China, that pain felt by the Chinese exporters of these consumer goods is not going to transpire as quickly
Mhm.
because the export always has a longer cycle of payment, repayment. So for the Chinese export, although they also suffer, the reaction, chain reaction is much longer. So I think, like you pointed out, I think President Trump immediately starts to feel first the stock market start to react to it and the bond market starts to react to it, and he cares about these future economic indicators a lot. And
Mhm.
when we also saw that the public opinion starts to turn around and start to have questions about this tariff policy, I think that put a lot of domestic political pressure on President Trump, who promised to work for American people. But he had to
Yeah.
face the question that, well, how come American people suddenly do not have the supplies that they need because of the tariff policy? So the Chinese definitely prepared for it. Another element that I think the Chinese prepared for it is backdoor channel or backdoor access into the US market. I think I see a question in the chat box. Sorry, I just took a glimpse of it. Said which country is a top trading partner for the US states? It's actually Mexico. Because
Mm.
from the Chinese perspective, they have been trying to build these processing centers or manufacturing factories in Mexico because Mexico has a lower tariff barrier into the US market, right? So if you are a Chinese producer, you're looking at, oh, well, if I produce and export from China, I have to pay more than 40% of tariff, but Mexico faces a much lower tariff rate, then I will want to invest in Mexico and produce locally to export to the US market. So I think these backdoors were quite prevalent across the global south. Look at Mexico, look at Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Those are main production centers that the Chinese exporters have built across the world in order to access the US market. So it poses a critical question to China that, well, if you want to the United States, that if US wants to fight a tariff war with China, are you willing to also sever your trade relationship with all these intermediaries or these processing centers that China have built around the world? And that essentially means that the US will have to cut itself out from a good number of trading partners in the whole world. And that's extremely difficult for the US domestic consumers to absorb. So there are all these elements, and I think you build a very comprehensive argument on rare earths. So I won't repeat that, but rare earths was definitely a choke point that China has over our industries, especially high-tech industries. I think 20 years ago, we used to say that, oh, well, rare earth processing is heavily polluting, and we don't want to bring that to our domestic soil. We want China to pollute their own land, and
Mhm.
we can just enjoy the benefit of the Chinese processing center. But now we're looking at China monopolizing 90% of the rare earth production, and everything from semiconductor chips to high-end defense technology products. That rare earth is indispensable. But the good news might be 2 weeks ago, the Australian company Linus, they have invested in a rare earth processing center in Malaysia. And two
Mm.
weeks ago, that processing center has commenced their production of rare earths. It's only one type of rare earth element, but I think they're looking to expand that to a broader spectrum of rare earth products. So hopefully, this choke point that China has is not going to last forever.
So, yes, so Yin, some of the things you were talking about related to like transshipments, like if you look at the things that you're buying on a daily basis, you'll see that there are more things that are made from Cambodia, there are more things made from Vietnam, there are more things made from Mexico. Um, but what Yun is suggesting, and I think this is right, is that a lot of those things are made from Chinese companies that have invested in those areas to do some sort of final processing of goods. And it's very, very hard, I think, for the U.S. government to track that carefully and then, try to tariff things that are, somehow origin from China. So yeah, I think it is really interesting how well prepared China has become. I mean, they had a significant amount of time between the first trade war in the first Trump administration. Biden, of course, kept some of the tariffs on, but didn't do a lot of new policy in terms of well, they did some related to electric vehicles, but it wasn't like a full-blown trade war. And so I think the Chinese government had some time to prepare for sure.
Yeah, and looking at this Chinese economic model, right? We see that there are three things generate economic growth. There's investment, there's domestic consumption, and then there's export. Those
Yeah.
are where economic growth comes from. And you look at how the Chinese have relied on export because, well, Chinese government eternally talks about the need to stimulate domestic consumption without much of a success because Chinese people like to save, not because they love to save, but because throughout history, the governments really did not take good care of people, right? So they have to save in order to build their own social security network to pay for the education and their medical bills when they get older. So when we look at the Chinese economic growth model, so much of it is built on export.
Mhm.
Last year, the Chinese trade surplus vis-a-vis the whole world was 1.1 trillion US dollars. And Mary, I'm really curious about your assessment of this. This cannot continue forever, right? We have seen the Chinese trade surplus vis-a-vis the world just keeps growing, keeps growing. But there
Yeah.
got to be some point that this is going to come to a stop because it's already being labeled Chinese dumping of goods all over the world. It's Chinese
Mhm.
overcapacity that's edging out or elbowing out every country's industry. The Chinese said, we build our EVs most effectively. None of your
Mhm.
countries need to have your own EV industry. Just
Yeah.
import Chinese EVs. It's cheap, it's effective, it's better technology. But do you think that's sustainable?
I think there are so many things that are uncertain right now. I find it very hard to predict what the trends will be. And that has something to do with the kind of the world we're in regarding conflict. The war in the Middle East is very destabilizing. But the other thing, and of course, AI and what will happen with manufacturing in general, if automation really goes as quickly as some people are predicting. I I've given a lot of examples of how I think about manufacturing. So I love to look to see where things are made. And I was recently in a store in South Bend, close to the Notre Dame campus, that is a international market, and it's owned by it's mostly a sort of a Middle Eastern Arab American market. And because you can sometimes get like better vegetable, I know you get more interesting food when you go to international market. And what I noticed was in the area where they were selling household appliances, and they were selling things that were very culturally specific to the Arab world. So they were selling different types of teapots, they were selling different types of um, things to make food in, things to how you chop food, and things that are, in a way, kind of similar to what we would buy here, but slightly different because it's for this particular cultural and ethnic group. What was really fascinating to me is that most of those things were made in China. And I really wondered about what that meant for not so, I mean, I understand how Americans think about it. And of course, Americans are not happy that we manufacture so much less than we used to, even though the goods that we do buy from China are now very high quality often and cheaper. But I do feel like there's a sense that like it's important that you manufacture things yourselves, particularly for supply chain resilience, particularly for when crises happens like a pandemic and you can't get things from far away. But it really did strike me that it's interesting that these are more developing countries, and could maybe benefit from having manufacturing, and yet they don't have manufacturing. And so I wonder, I think the real pushback against China on manufacturing is not going to, of course, it has already come from the United States in the trade war. and it's come to some degree from Europe. But I think the countries that we will start to really see it from are the countries in Africa and maybe parts of Southeast Asia that have large populations that really do want to use manufacturing to become wealthier and more developed, because those are the places that are really going to lose out because they can't get onto this ladder of making kind of labor intensive goods up to sort of more capital intensive goods, and to become richer and more developed and more educated as the economy changes. However, and this is why I said it's very uncertain and hard to predict, I don't know if AI ends up sort of obliterating the need for blue collar workers on a production line, because that can be done by robotics and by automation. Maybe something completely different will happen, but it's hard for me to sort of imagine what that will look like.
Yeah, that's really a keen observation because if you look at the global South trading data with China, it's brutal. Like
Mhm.
we here in the United States, we see that, oh yeah, we buy so much Chinese goods. Of course, we run a trade deficit vis-a-vis China, right? But I think it's hard for people to imagine African continent as a whole in the year of 2025 run a trade deficit vis-a-vis China of more than 100 billion US dollars. This is Africa, and it's against common sense, right? Africa exports all its raw materials to China. Then why would Africa run a trade deficit of that magnitude vis-a-vis the Chinese? It turned out that Africa manufacturing capability, like you said, has been pretty much wiped out by the Chinese cheap products. That is
Mhm.
cheaper and easier to just import from the Chinese sources. Why would they set up their own manufacturing centers? But then it raises a question of where is the future of their economy?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
if they just continue to exhaust their raw materials and they do not build up their industrial capability, then where will they go in the future? And just related to this particular point, I know there's a lot of hype about AI being the new economic driving force. Do you see that that is going to change how US approach the world economy or the relationship with the world, and how China will um, change its own approach to, for example, manufacturing business?
I have trouble answering these questions because I feel like right now AI is changing very, very rapidly, and it's hard to understand. Both. I mean, I'm at a university, you're at a think tank. I see in real time how it's affecting how students study, how students learn, how professors do research, how our staff. I mean, in some ways, I think staff are very worried about it in terms of their employment. But I think if you're already employed, AI is really just going to help you become more efficient.
Mm.
And in many ways, AI can help people solve problems. I mean, one of my staff people said to me yesterday, she said she had to plan a trip to the East Coast to take her son to see colleges, and she just asked AI to plan the whole trip, and it did a great job. And I just said, well, talk to me when you get back and make sure that everything went well. So people are using AI in very, very interesting ways. Um, and of course, the use of robotics and automated technology in production has massively improved production, and I think also made it safer for workers, because workers are being taken out of the most dangerous and polluting parts of the production process. Um, but I don't, and this is because I'm not an expert in AI. I don't know or really understand the next jump to the AI kind of doing more and more of the production process and really truly sort of eliminating the need for humans. I mean, I've listened to podcasts and read books about the really most strange things that could happen, but I would think, and this maybe we should talk a little bit about China's domestic economy, because it's interesting. We're talking a lot to you about how successful the Chinese economy is and how dominant the Chinese economy is globally. But at the same time, and these are really two interrelated problems, the Chinese economy domestically is quite stuck. And I think people in China feel a sense of stagnation. that they haven't ever, I mean, the people who are living through it right now have really never experienced it because China has been growing so rapidly since the 1980s. So it's interesting to think about this problem where China is both very dominant globally, but having real difficulty with its domestic economy. And in terms of AI, I think if AI comes very rapidly and really eliminates the need for low-level production workers, eliminates the need for labor-intensive workers working on these supply chains, China will face real domestic social stability problems.
Wow, that's hard to imagine that what would that look like because yeah, I think the rate of discontent as a result of all the changes that the Chinese government has adopted is I guess you could say that it has been on the rise.
Mhm.
But we're all observing the Chinese domestic politics pretty closely. Would you say that is, well, in my view, I definitely see the society closing up and being
Mhm.
tightened by the
Mhm.
by the current government in China, especially the current leader, President Xi. And well, when he first came into power, people saw that, well, maybe he could be the reform figure, right?
Yeah.
That his father was persecuted during the Cultural Revolution. He has a princeling background, and he himself was also a victim of the Cultural Revolution. People saw that, well, he would resent Cultural Revolution, and he potentially could push China and the Chinese domestic politics to the next stage of liberalism. Boy, weren't we wrong. And what
Yeah.
we have seen in the past 13 years is just this constant adding on to the tightening of the
Mhm.
society. That social management is actually now a major in university. That how do you
Mhm.
manage the society and is a dedicated profession,
Mhm.
including monitoring of public opinion, monitoring of all the social media apps in China, the Great Firewall, and the suppression of civil society organizations. So all those, I think some would say, is a regression rather than
Mhm.
a progress of the Chinese domestic politics. Because I remember being based in China about 15 years ago, it was quite liberal. You can
Mhm.
complain about the government. You could
Yeah.
say that the leader is an idiot, the leader doesn't know what he's doing, which is no longer possible in China today, right? Can you give us a little genesis of what happened? So how come we saw this progress towards more
Mhm.
liberalism and then it just clamped down? And
Mhm.
is it
Yeah.
ever going to open again in your view as a sinologist?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. I feel that, and I the last time I lived in China for an extended period of time was 2012, 2013, and I was there with my husband and my three kids. My kids were in Chinese schools, and this was the year that Xi Jinping took power. It was also the year of the air apocalypse. I don't know if people remember this term. It was when the air pollution problems really peaked in
Oh,
China
right.
when air quality was at its worst, and the middle class in a lot of Chinese cities were really angry that they couldn't protect their kids and their own health from really severe air pollution. So my kids, their school would be closed sometimes because the air was bad. Sometimes they couldn't go outside during gym. My son, who was in first grade, he got sick quite a lot. He got pneumonia and bronchitis because of bad air, and people were buying air filters, and I think there was a very palpable sense at that time that the Chinese economic model was unsustainable, and that was partly because pollution had gotten so bad, and there were lots of protests around workers' rights and higher wages, demands for more social security. So you really did feel in that time period that China was at a very precarious position and that things could become very unstable. That same year, Xi Jinping, the current president, came into power and he started to quickly crack down. He cracked down on labor, on workers. He cracked down on lawyers and civil rights activists. He cracked down on women and feminists advocating for greater expansion of women's rights. And he was very good and strategic, good in the smart, I don't mean good normatively, but smart in really going after the elites who were trying to mobilize society around these issues. Um, and like you're saying, Yun, he was able to really eliminate the ability for society to organize. Um, in 2018, Xi Jinping started his second term. He then removed the term limits for the presidency and the vice presidency, which was unprecedented the since the reform era really began, although Deng Xiaoping was slightly different, but there was this beginning of a norm of a president and a party secretary of the Communist Party would serve only for 10 years. And Xi Jinping ended that. He's now in his third term, and it's likely that he'll continue take a fourth term. So how did he do that? I think he did that partly because people did really feel insecure at the time. And I think people welcomed this idea of a strong man, of having somebody who was stronger than the past leader before him, Hu Jintao, who was seen as very weak. And I think we see this in the United States with the people who have voted for Donald Trump, that we need somebody who's very strong, who's going to make big decisions, who's going to do something, maybe breaking down norms. And we see this in other parts of the world too. And I think when the global security and the global economy becomes more unstable, people gravitate towards this idea of a strong man. And that happened in China, maybe even earlier than the United States. For what this means for the future, okay, the thing that I would point to around that is Xi Jinping's decision during the COVID pandemic to lock down the city of Shanghai completely, a city of 30 million people. Really unprecedented. I think angered a lot of people who had never who knew that they lived in an authoritarian society but never thought it was going to affect them so personally. And the zero COVID lockdown of the spring of 2022 in Shanghai, I think, led eventually to this outpouring of anger towards Xi Jinping at the end of 2022, when something happened called the blank paper movement, or the blank sheet movement, when people just, in order to protest, just went outside and held up sheets of blank paper, because that was, you couldn't get in trouble if the paper didn't have anything on it. What struck me about that protest is that people were no longer complaining just about livelihood issues, or they weren't just complaining about the pandemic. They actually demanded that Xi Jinping step down. So I do feel like he's been very good at removing the ability for Chinese society to organize and to protest in an organized way. I'm not sure he's eliminated the ability for things to really blow up in a way that's a little bit more unpredictable. And he's also, yeah, so I think that's the concern I have now. It's not immediate. I'm not predicting that the Chinese government is about to topple, because I don't think that's the case at all. Because I think he's also done things that people really like. He's cleaned up the environment. He's made China more safe. He has paid attention to things that rural people really care about. So in some ways, he's a quite popular leader among what we might call the masses, people who are maybe lower income. I think he's more unpopular in the elites and among some people in the government. But I don't think people in China really appreciate or like living in such a controlled society. Chinese society is pretty dynamic, and I think people like to live in a place where there's more freedom. And I don't mean freedom in a political sense, but I mean more in a kind of social and economic sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as sinologists, we visit China, right? We know the boundaries. The boundaries almost are visible, because if you talk to a certain people, you will get a call, you will get a talk to, and
Yeah.
there's those almost invisible lines that once you cross it, you're going to see the consequences and the pushback almost immediately. But the other aspect of this, I noticed, because I travel to China quite frequently, almost like every other month, for conferences and for field research. The other aspect of this is that if you stay away from those triggers, if you are just leading as a average citizen without
Yeah.
much of a political aspiration, you're not trying to challenge the rule of the party, you're not trying to accuse the leader, then a lot of things are basically, well, you don't feel that you don't feel those limits exist. I
Yeah.
guess what I'm trying to say is that those tightened control measures, you only feel it when
Hmm.
you approach what they are trying to protect. But
Yeah.
if you are just the average citizen and not trying to have any political motivation or political aspiration, then you can live a pretty free, almost I want to say free. There's a in the Chinese society, there's a joke in the in the Chinese society that you don't have a problem with the government until you become the victim of that government, right? Until your own rights are trampled over, until say your family became the victim of the system, and you might with the unjust treatment of the Chinese um, bureaucracy, and that's when you start to really see the problem, right? But
Hmm.
if you don't even have those aspirations, you won't have a problem. And especially for the foreign policy work that I do, I talk to Chinese foreign policy advisors, Chinese foreign policy analysts, and I constantly, when I'm in China, I feel the pressure that, oh, well, you don't ask certain sensitive questions and you have to be always look over your shoulder and see if someone is following you. But then I also realized that for people, average American tourists going to China, not doing anything political or anything policy related, you can have a hell of a time.
Hmm.
It's safe, it's fun, it's cheap, and it's great food. So I can understand why that the China experience can be so different for foreigners and also for Chinese citizens. But then again, like you were talking about the elites, I think you're absolutely correct that the elites are the ones who have had the most difficult time adjusting, especially after, think about it, from 1979 to 2013 when Xi Jinping took over. Chinese society basically had a good 40 years
Hmm.
of liberalization, gradual increasing liberalization, and then they suddenly closed down. And
Hmm.
for people, it's almost like who got the opportunity to take a glimpse of what it could be, what it might look like.
Yeah.
And now to tell them that no, 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 you have to go back to your shell. The government is clamping down and you're not allowed to talk about those political issues anymore. I think they are the ones who have the most difficult time
Yeah.
adjusting. But here comes an interesting question. And here in Washington, people like to talk about it. I think it's more of a I don't know, a legend or a wishful thinking that people like to talk to. Then who do you think is the biggest threat to Xi Jinping's power? Because some would
Yeah.
say it's the PLA. The PLA are being
Hmm.
purged. That won't they want to launch a coup? Why wouldn't they want to launch a coup, right?
Hmm.
That if
Hmm.
your survival is being threatened by the top leader and you control the military, coup is your only natural solution. And you would assume that some of these PLA might see eye to eye with some of these political elites. Then voila, wouldn't some of
Hmm.
those reform-oriented elderlies form an alliance with the military? And then there we go. There could be a possibility of change. I hear people in the policy arena talk about this possibility almost like quite constantly, regularly. From your observation, is that even remotely possible?
I will preface my answer with saying that we are very, very bad at predicting when regimes collapse. And of course, then academics are criticized, for example, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 89 or really 1991. And it's partly because regimes that are authoritarian often look very, very strong in terms of how they project power. but they might be quite fragile. And so they can project power, but when that power is tested, they can fragment very quickly. There is a lot of evidence, I think, in the data on regime change that authoritarian regimes are more likely to fall through intra-elite uh, a coup or some sort of intra-elite split. And so the elite split is more common than an uprising from below, an uprising from the streets, right? An uprising of people protesting. Sometimes protests happen afterwards, and so it's not so clearly like one or the other. But I think there is a lot of evidence that the key is that the elite need to split, and when the elite split, then the key question is, what does the military do? Does the military go with the reformers? Does the military shoot people who are starting to protest? And so the military may. I can't imagine. It's hard for me to imagine that the PLA would launch a coup against the party. That would be very unprecedented. But I could imagine scenarios where there's an intra-elite conflict in China and the military decides to go in a direction that is against Xi Jinping. Because as you mentioned, and as people have probably read, Xi Jinping has purged more military high-ranking officials, I think, than even Mao. And currently on the Central Military Commission, which is the key organizing body of the Chinese military, which is the military of the party, there are only two people on it, which is Xi Jinping and another more low-ranking disciplinary person. So the Chinese military is in a really interesting scenario right now. But what I would imagine is that if there's a way, I think it would take some sort of spark outside, like some sort of economic crisis or something. I do feel like people are quite disappointed in the way that Xi Jinping has managed the domestic economy.
Yeah, he certainly has delivered a lot, like national pride to the
Yeah,
Chinese people. I think look at the resilience that China was able to build since 2018. I've also
yeah.
seen a lot of compliments coming even from the policy elites who didn't agree with him at the first place. Now they
Hmm.
see that, oh, actually, he was pretty far-sighted to build the rare earth industry,
Yep.
to build the EVs, to get ahead of the energy demand that Chinese economy would
Yes.
have. So all those I think we're seeing as his strengths or the deliverables that he has delivered to Chinese people. But it's funny that you talk about the intra-elite split because for people who read Chinese history, especially read the feudalist society and how the emperors
Hmm.
managed their subordinates to
Yeah.
create inter-elite split was a classic tactic that the emperors used in the back days because you are looking at very powerful officials, right? Cabinet members. So how do you control all of them? You balance one against the other.
Hmm.
So it's actually one chapter of I think what's it called like 帝王术, the ways of the emperor that you have to master. So I think there are so many issues we can discuss, and this is a great, fascinating discussion. But I
Yeah,
would
there's a lot of questions, so we should
yeah, a
get to
lot
the
of questions.
questions.
We
Yeah.
should get to the questions. I'll
All
hand
right.
over it back to our chair. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mary and Yun. We do have several questions here. We'll start with Carla Mays. Carla, you were kind of first in line there. You out there, Carla? Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Capelli. I'm Carla's co-founder. I grew up 10 minutes from the Foxconn plant in Racine
Oh,
County, Wisconsin. For
yes.
those who don't know, we're on the Amtrak train right between Walking Chicago, fourth generation. Um, our question was, there were two questions. The first was, what other states besides California have China as their number one trading partner? And then number two, there seems to be a generational gap in how we talk about U.S. China relations. The younger generation is really interested in this new
Mhm.
trend of China maxing. There was an
Mhm.
article on this in the Washington Post and Wall
And
Street Journal
BBC.
and BBC on this idea of China maxing.
Yeah.
And as we call it, the TikTok generation. In fact, I'm older than the TikTok generation now as a millennial. And understanding the younger demographics, how they're viewing China and conversating much differently than this more traditional esoteric conversation about the Cold War and China and human
Yeah.
rights. There's a focus on TikTok and what they're saying.
And I would say a lot of it. So David and I have for 11 years run an NGO focused on smart cities and in dealing with AI and automation. And what we see is like there's definitely a different conversation that like I will say folks that are older, and I will say even I will say it normally goes I will say maybe 55 and older. It's even like the younger, there's a lot of folks in America, and I will say a lot of young people that want to live in China. It's cheaper, quality of life is different, and they feel that quality of life in the United States is going down. And they see you can like whether it's BYD or other, the cars are cheaper, the cost of living is cheaper. And so the question is that, how does that differ in our research and things, and from what is kind of the norm, what gets talked about, and then there's what you see going on the socials.
Okay, I, I, I'm sure you have lots of things to say too. I think this China maxing is super interesting, although I have not partaken of it myself because I am actually 56 years old, so I'm like 1 year older. So I'm not allowed to take. No, I'm just kidding. I've lived in China for extended periods, and there are really important ways in which Chinese cities in particular have become very, very livable, particularly cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Hangzhou. They're just, the infrastructure has improved. There's, I think what's really remarkable about Chinese city life is that it's very convenient and it's relatively affordable for Americans who are moving to China. I guess what I would caution people about in terms of thinking about that as a way to see all of China is that China itself also deals with, like the United States, a lot of inequality, a lot of a very, very weak welfare state, and a very, very massive urban rural divide. And so a lot of what we consume on TikTok or what we consume in social media tends to portray a very affluent part of Chinese life, although there is parts of rural Chinese society that I think is also quite popular right now. But again, it tends to draw from, I think, the higher end. And so for Americans, even Americans who are more middle class moving to China, you would probably still seem like the cost of living is very manageable. But for people who are born in rural China, I think there are still lots of barriers, lots of types of discrimination that would be very recognizable to people from America. So what I would say is that China does have some big advantages in terms of how they've made their cities livable and convenient, and the infrastructure is good in ways that Chinese American cities haven't quite kept up with. But I think they also have the same, very similar social problems that we deal with in the United States.
I agree. Well, first, I think I asked AI, and the other two big states that are top trading partners with China is Georgia and Pennsylvania. So basically, states that imports a lot of machineries and electronic devices, and California apparently. So with this China maxing, I think it's like what we just discussed. You don't realize your freedom is no longer there until you don't have it, right? Until it becomes a problem. Like I'll give you one example. During the first 2 years of COVID, the Chinese society became extremely, I would say, xenophobic because they believed the foreigners traveling overseas and into China were bringing the COVID viruses with them and infecting the Chinese local population. So there was a visible push for the foreigners to leave and not to return. And I think, well, you don't feel the oxygen is not there until you are deprived of it. So I think for foreigners living in China, for all the reasons Mary just mentioned, it's cheap, it's convenient, it's fantastic, it's great food, and people are so friendly. But I think it's always the rainy days that test, I would say, the bottom lines of what the society is willing to offer to protect your rights. So when everything is going well, sure. But when things are not going well, I think that's a true test of what protection the state would offer you. Like, for example, do foreigners have the same rights in China as nationals? Are foreigners allowed to apply for certain jobs? Remember, the Chinese society is pretty homogeneous throughout history, right? So absorbing in foreigners is not a very common phenomena. You can visit, but you are always going to be a visitor. You can live there for your whole life, but you will always wear the label that, oh, you are a 老外, you're an old foreigner. I think that's another element of the Chinese society that people don't really think about. That like one example I like to give people is that, well, I'm originally from China. I came to US 20 years ago. And I'm able to get a job in the US think tank. I live in the Washington, D.C. area and express my opinion about what US policy looks like. Can you imagine, Mary, can you imagine a blonde American going to Beijing, being educated there, and then being allowed to get a job at a Chinese think tank that participates in the policy deliberation? Would I tell my Chinese colleagues that, well, think about what has happened to me and think about an American equivalent working in Beijing on these key critical foreign policy issues? They're like, no, 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 that will never happen in our lifetime. That cannot be allowed. So I think a lot of things will require more thoughtful comparisons. Again, there's no good or bad. It's not to say that what the Chinese is that the society or the way of being is inferior, but I'm just saying that there are so many elements, so many different phases of the Chinese society that TikTok does not always reveal. And there is I feel, a romanticization of a lot of the elements that people do see on TikTok, but I don't think that's always the representativeness of the true China that we see.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was a good, very interesting question. I wasn't aware of that. I'm well past 55, so I guess I don't even know anything about that. So, Paul Jeter, I think you're next here. You got a question?
Yes. I was curious, what will be the impact on the relationship given the future of Taiwan in light of the U.S. and Russian states' military aggressive behavior on the global stage?
I think Yun should take a crack at that first, since she's really a foreign
Okay.
policy expert.
I'll take a crack at it. I think the Chinese are loving it, honestly.
Yeah.
US is being bogged down in the Middle East. US is distracted. US is prioritizing Western Hemisphere. So that's everything that Chinese have asked the US to do, right? Leave us alone in our neighborhood, that you are a Pacific country, but you're not an Asian country. Your presence and participation in the rulemaking in the Asian world is not guaranteed. So I think there are a lot of elements of the current US foreign policy that the Chinese are finding quite China friendly, honestly speaking, especially after the trade war last year turned out to be not really a victorious ending for the United States. The Chinese have been more confident than ever that, at least for my 20 plus years career working on US China relations, I've never seen the Chinese being so confident. The US may not like this policy, so what? What can you do about it? Or that, oh, US feels that China is coming to the Western Hemisphere. China is getting into the critical infrastructure sector of Latin America. So what? What can you do? So I think that boldness or the level of confidence has increased quite significantly under the current administration. And the other piece that the Chinese do enjoy is the fact that the second Trump administration has not talked about great power competition as a theme of U.S. national security strategy at all, which is great news for China, right? That for 40, 50 years, the Chinese were able to build their strengths, to build their wealth based on a U.S. engagement policy with China. And when U.S. in 2017 declared great power competition as a theme of U.S. national security strategy, China immediately became the top priority or the top target because China is that pacing threat. And that led to what the Chinese called 8 years of turbulences of the U.S.-China relations. U.S. finally turned around and see China as a competitor rather than a partner. And that has led to the escalation and disturbance in the bilateral relations. Now the Trump administration is focused on homeland security, illegal immigrants, DEI, and the things like drug lords from Central America. So for the Chinese, that's a great window of opportunity for China to use the time that U.S. is distracted to build China's own strengths. And if there is again, a return to great power competition down the road, I think the Chinese position has been greatly improved. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I agree, and I feel like on the question of Taiwan, I write a biweekly column, and I wrote one today about Taiwan and the impact on how the United States might see Taiwan with given the war in the Middle East. Particularly if the war in the Middle East is prolonged with ground troops and things like that. And I think Yun is exactly right to say that China will benefit. I think it's actually probably good for this idea of perhaps avoiding a military conflict over Taiwan. I worry that the United States and the American public in particular is not really prepared to lose American lives to defend Taiwan. And many people probably don't fully understand, why Taiwan would even be important, although I do feel like Taiwan is a very important issue. But there are a couple of things that have changed. So China has become, under Xi Jinping, very worried about Taiwan because Xi Jinping has said that this is something that should not be passed down generation to generation. It should be something that is solved more quickly. And he felt that way because he felt that Taiwan was becoming more and more separate from the mainland as time went on. But I think what's happening recently in Taiwan's domestic society, partly because of China's own ability to use propaganda and social media and in some cases misinformation, the Taiwanese population has become more polarized around the issue of the future of its relations with the mainland. And there's a party that is pro-independence, and that there's a party that is not pro-independence. And for the first time ever, we're starting to see younger voters in Taiwan actually be less pro-independence than their older cohorts. And I think that's a really important sign to Xi Jinping that perhaps if he just waits and this trend continues, the United States continues to be preoccupied, there might be a real chance of a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue to China's favor in a way that I don't think any of us imagined, 5 or 10 years before. And so, I think the United States and the American public, looking at the war in Ukraine, looking at the war in the Middle East, looking at what the United States is doing both in Venezuela and Cuba, I feel like the United States public, the American public, will have very limited tolerance for a major military conflict with China over the island of Taiwan.
All right, thank you. So how much do you think Xi's concern about his legacy is tied to this?
I suppose he thinks it's important, but at the same time, he's not making it worse. I mean, he's certainly improving China's chances. I don't think it's the case really, partly because his own military is in a little bit of a disarray, that he will invade Taiwan in 2027, which I think some people believed based on things that he had said, kind of that might have suggested that. I don't know, Yun, do you think it will become something that he needs to resolve before he steps down or dies in office?
As I think the answer is always going to be yes. Does Xi Jinping want reunification? Oh, absolutely. But that's not what drives his behavior. Any Chinese leader in charge of the Chinese Communist Party will want unification to be a part of his legacy. The question is whether it is viable for him to use military power against Taiwan and be successful. So in other words, it's not about whether he wants it, he always wants it, but it's about whether the calculation of the risk and the determination of the chance of success in the event of a potential U.S. military intervention. Meaning that while Xi Jinping tells PLA to fight, PLA went to fight. But is PLA going to be successful? I think that's what's driving his behavior or driving his decision. Because no Chinese leader, yeah, he wants unification as a part of his legacy, but he also absolutely does not want a failed attempt on unification to be his legacy, right? Because that most likely could mean that Taiwan will go independent. And does he want that to be a part of his legacy? So I think that's why the situation across the Taiwan Strait is so much hinged on the deterrence that U.S. has been able to project against the Chinese military adventurism. Because if you think about it, if U.S. does not intervene, the Chinese PLA has no problem taking over the Taiwanese military, right? Just think about the size of the vast disparity between the military powers. The PLA boasts more than 2 million troops. The Taiwanese military is 170,000 people. The Chinese military budget is $280 billion a year, and the Taiwanese military budget is a fraction of that. Just think about the vast disparity. What has held the delicate peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait? I would say is U.S. strategic ambiguity. That the U.S. may or may not intervene, but China or Taiwan, you do not want to try, right? So I think that essentially is what Xi Jinping's decision is contingent upon. It's not whether he wants it, but whether China can be successful in such a military campaign.
All right, thank you very much. Cynthia Miller, I think you're up next.
What are your expectations for the upcoming Trump-Xi meeting, assuming it actually takes place, of course? You think Trump's position has been affected by the Iran war, the current Iran war? And if so, in what way?
I can give it a go. I think it has definitely been affected because the trip was supposed to take place actually today.
Yeah,
It
today.
was supposed to be in Beijing today. And because of the war on Iran, this is already postponed for 6 weeks to May 14th and 15th. So I think the impact there is obvious. I think whatever happens during the trip, this will be declared a great victory of American people. And honestly, I think the Chinese have the tendency or have the intention to play along with that narrative because they want to give Trump a win, right? It is in China's every interest to maintain a friendly and a positive relationship with President Trump. Because compared to the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, Trump administration has been viewed with great friendliness and receptiveness by the Chinese government. So we are definitely going to see big bills of purchase by the Chinese of American agriculture products, Boeing airplanes for sure, and there's also discussions about the Chinese purchase of American energy products. We didn't talk about energy, but the U.S. is an exporter of LNG and crude oil. We're no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil, but the Chinese are still quite dependent on foreign crude oil. So I think the announcement coming out of the trip is going to be quite victorious from a Trump administration perspective because they're thinking about addressing the trade imbalance, making China buy more American goods, pleasing or catering to the demand of American farmers. I think the Chinese are going to check all those boxes.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think the Chinese government and the Chinese military are learning a lot about the American military capacity in the war in the Middle East, and in some ways are probably quite impressed with some aspects of American military might and particularly joint force coordination. And I think that was also the case in the taking of Venezuelan President Maduro. I think there are ways in which it must be interesting for China to observe the military superiority of the U.S., but at the same time, a kind of strategic. I'm not sure it's too early to say strategic failure, but I think real struggles in the war against the Islamic Republic, and the ways in which relatively low tech military um, munitions, including the drones that Iran has, and other ways that they've interrupted the straits. I think they're learning quite a lot. And so one criticism of the Chinese military, of course, is that it hasn't really fought a major war for a very long time. It fought a border war with Vietnam. It had some skirmishes with India more recently, but it hasn't really been battle tested in the way that the United States has. But at the same time, China is able to learn quite a lot about how the U.S. military has successes and also has failures when there's an action like this. I don't know if there's any evidence for this, but I would also imagine that the Chinese government is quite concerned about the assassination of assassination. I don't know what you call it, because it's a massive elimination of the Iranian leadership, as well as the kidnapping of Maduro. I would imagine that makes China quite nervous about what the U.S. military under Trump would do, and in some ways, the military under Trump seems so unpredictable.
All right. Thank you. Betty, Thompson, you have a question?
I do. Last week we had a program on we wanted to address the Hormuz Strait and with the Iranian situation. It wasn't a program we had planned, but we took the opportunity. Part of our mission is to prevent programs that are timely and urgent. We thought, well, this is timely and urgent. And one of the slides that our presenter showed was the critical choke points straits around the world. That was fascinating because it's not just the Hormuz. For several years, the Suez Canal was closed down, and how that impacted a trade. And of course, you can always go around the Cape of Good Hope, but that's such a long distance. And these other straits meant to minimize that. The Taiwan Strait is another critical global choke point of trade, and particularly with the production of Taiwan's massive production of chips, semiconductors. And China is business, is all business. And they may want reunification, but they also are probably having their eye on that strait and the semiconductor business. What do you anticipate in their endeavor for reunification if there's a intervention of interfering? That strait is a major shipping lane for much of the trading that goes on in that part of the world, which is a huge populated area of tremendous trade and manufacturing. So what of the strait? How is China going to deal with that? Does that give Taiwan some leverage? Do you go in and have an intervention but keep things copacetic on the strait, because they're not at all copacetic at Hormuz? And either Mary or Yun, either one, both. What is your comment on that?
Well, I'm not an expert in military strategy, but I would imagine that if we're talking about the Taiwan Straits,
this is an economic question. This is the trade that comes out of that strait.
Yeah, both the United States through its forces in Japan and other parts of the Indo-Pacific may have the ability to keep the lanes open. But in the event of a military conflict between China and the United States over the island of Taiwan, I think there would be a real interruption of trade flows around the island more broadly. China has a lot of other pressure points going into Southeast Asia that would also be impacted if the United States was able to, block the Straits of Malacca or other parts of Southeast Asia. So I think that, as globalization has become more fraught, we've seen the weaponization of all of these kind of strategic choke points, and the choke point could be the straits of a certain area, for the movement of trade, but it also could be things like rare earths, minerals. So there's all of the ways in which governments are trying to figure out where do they have leverage. And obviously the Iranian government has discovered it's the Straits of Hormuz. China, it's rare earths. The United States also has various choke points which it's used, and we're really in a new era of interdependence has become highly dangerous as opposed to sort of mutually reinforcing and beneficial.
Okay, well, I will just share just very, very quickly, just share one thing. So here is a rough map of what we're looking at. So if you look at China and you look at the Chinese coast, maritime shipping, because of its lower cost, is still the dominant form of global trade and global shipping, especially container shipping. So if you look at what the Chinese have to do, well, remember, China is a world factory, and most of its products still have to be shipped through it's through the more economic form of maritime shipping. What it means that Chinese have to ship their export from their coastal areas, right? So I would say that in the case of the Taiwan Strait, it's really a double-edged sword. That if you have a war that shut down the trade goes both ways. It's both the Chinese import and Chinese export will be disrupted because of a disruption in the Taiwan Strait. Some argue that, well, ships don't have to go through Taiwan Strait in order to ship, for example, to South Korea or Japan. It can go to the eastern side of the Taiwan island. That it takes a little bit more time, but is still a viable shipping route. So I think that is definitely a consideration. So when we think about the Taiwan contingency scenario, I think it's going to be a huge disruption for the global economy, but it's also going to be a bigger disruption for the Chinese economy. The Chinese won't be able to trade, and they will be put under all these sanctions. Remember, just think about all the sanctions that Russia has had to endure because of its invasion of Ukraine, and how crippling those sanctions have become. I think for the Chinese, the deterrence effect over their potential military action against Taiwan, the first barrier is always, is our military campaign going to be successful? And the second question is going to be, well, even if we're successful, what is the cost that we have to pay for it? Because well, Xi Jinping has stated that he has a China dream, right? What is China dream? The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. What is rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? It's not just about national unification. National unification might be an indispensable component to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But if the cost of the unification is the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, meaning that China will be put under so many different layers of sanctions that the Chinese economy is actually going to deteriorate so significantly, then they also have to calculate whether this is a worthwhile military campaign to take or to kick the can down the road and wait for another day to fight over Taiwan. And then again, it goes back to the U.S. military commitment that if the Chinese believe that the U.S. is on decline, and remember this statement, the Chinese believe time is on China's side. Why? Because they believe that there will be a day when the United States will be so exhausted by its security commitment to an island so far away from the U.S. homeland. Until that day comes, the political will of Taiwan to negotiate unification with mainland China is not going to emerge. So when you think about that time horizon and why the Chinese believe time is on their side, and look at the real economic cost of a Taiwan contingency, I think that's also a very strong factor that gives them pause. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. We have two more questions in the queue, and then I think we'll kind of wrap up at this point, but Claire Collins, you're up next.
Yeah, you mentioned that some of Xi Jinping's rivals are being purged, and when you say that, does that mean they're being executed? Like Kim Jong-il is famous for, Kim Jong-un, excuse me, is famous for executing his rivals, and I want to know that, and also, what about? I haven't heard anything about the Uyghurs in a long time, and I just wondered if they're going to be part of the manufacturing dynamo, or are they just living in concentration camps?
I would say no, that China in general, compared to both North Korea and the Soviet Union, has tended to do fewer executions of leaders after a purge, imprisonment or house arrest is a lot more common. Although I think in the anti-corruption campaign, where there have been these big purges recently, a significant amount of suicides, and some deaths that seem, I would say, suspicious. So it's hard to say. With the Uyghurs, I don't know, Yun, I haven't really also followed this as closely, or I certainly haven't seen reporting quite as much. The concentration camps, the re-education camps, whatever we want to talk about, explain what they were. Concentration camps makes it sound like people were being killed in them, and they were not being killed in them. They were being forced to stay in them, and they were often integrated into supply chains. So they were often attached to factories. My sense is that these are no longer being used as extensively as they were around 2018 to 2020, whether that was COVID or something else. I do think there are still very, very high levels of repression of Uyghurs who mostly live in Xinjiang, which is a northwestern province of China.
I
Oh,
agree.
and
Yeah, I think the killing of political rivals is no longer the norm. There's much higher suicide rates among officials that are being investigated, but it's also partially because once you commit suicide, the party will consider the case closed, right? And your family will be spared, and there won't be repercussion over your family members, especially your children. So some of the officials being investigated see suicide as an easier way out. But killing is no longer a norm. I think the last person that was killed, it was Lin Biao back in 1973. Anyway, different story.
oh, and also I wondered about how is the middle class doing? Are they buying the things that they manufacture? And if so, are they saving their money to buy the goods, or have they discovered credit cards?
Mm.
The
I think
Chinese, I would
that,
say, oh, go ahead.
nope, go ahead.
I think the funny thing is when I go to China, they have already completely bypassed the credit card usage, or bypass that stage, because in China it's all attached to your cell phone. There's mobile payment systems set up that link your social media account directly with your bank account, and you can do everything from ordering takeout food to ordering an Uber, and to pay for movie tickets or pay for whatever you need to buy through a mobile app. And in China, I generally, but as long as you have the mobile app, you don't need a wallet. You don't need credit cards. And everything is
Well,
processed through online, well, not even online banking, is e-banking.
so are they incurring debt? Whether it's a card or done on your cell phone, are they incurring debt, or have they figured out a way to live without going in debt and get
No,
everything they want?
consumer debt has gone up in China, through the use of, not exactly credit cards, but credit. I think the bigger issue related to the middle class and the lack of big consumption, although there are some programs that have tried to boost consumption recently by like giving rebates on bigger ticket items and subsidies. The big issue is the property crash, the real estate crash. And so, as you might remember, what happened to the United States after 2008, a lot of people in China are now what we would describe as being underwater, in the sense that the property values have crashed and gone down very, very rapidly. But they still owe money on the house. And so people in China, generally speaking, feel poorer because the major way in which Chinese families invest is through real estate. And so the collapse of the property market in China has created this really heavy weight on Chinese households. And that's one of the reasons why we see the domestic economy really struggling, because people no longer feel as wealthy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. One last question, Larry.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. And you just mentioned the issue of corruption and the crackdown on corruption. That was what I wanted to ask. Um, I was curious whether there's the perception that Xi has enriched himself while he's been in power as a la Putin. I sense not. And with the crackdowns on corruption that we've seen, I'm curious whether or not we're seeing less conspicuous consumption in China or by the offspring of the Chinese who are studying now in the States. I mean, it used to be that the first stop was at an exotic car dealer when someone came to the States to go to school, and they'd lease a Maserati or a BMW or something. And I'm curious whether there's more sensitivity about showing that you have money now, particularly if you didn't get it in the best way. Um, I've worked a lot in Africa and in China. I know that they don't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that's affected our ability to compete against China. So what drives them? And are we seeing less corruption or less conspicuous consumption that might indicate that their gains were made from corrupt practices?
I'll have Yun answer that. She's been in China very, very recently, so she'll have a sense.
Um, I think one thing I definitely notice is the social monitoring of luxurious behaviors has become much more keen in China, which is, well, if you are a government official and you wear say a super expensive watch or you drive a super fancy car, then people can see that, right? And Xi Jinping has been implementing this policy that if you are hired as a government official, you work in China and your family lives abroad, that immediately becomes a trigger. That's disciplinary. That you can be fired from your job or removed from your job because you're considered a naked official, that your family is no longer here, they're overseas enjoying their lives. And that's also regarded as a tell. But I would say that if you look at these are relatively superficial, that people don't have to show their wealth. If they are corrupt, they can just hide them, right? So deep down, the fact that the rate of investigation of corrupt officials is still so high. Think about it. Xi Jinping has been in power for almost 13, 14 years now. And there has been rounds and rounds and rounds of anti-corruption campaign targeting one generation after another officials and military officers. But still, there are still that many bad apples. So I think that tells you the universality of corruption in the Chinese society. And I think there are also signs and indicator of Xi Jinping's frustration with the bureaucracy, with the just as a pushback, the inertia from the bureaucracy against his anti-corruption campaign, that it remains to be a core problem, a cancerous cell in the Chinese society. Just look at how the government is targeting anti-corruption again and again, and still they can root out large groups of officials every time they look close enough. I think that tells me that the issue is not being cured at all.
Mhm. How about on campus? Are the students behaving differently?
Oh, Mary, that's in your in your department.
That's a good question. I mean, I think Chinese students on American campuses behave differently, not so much because of what's going on in China, but because of what's going on in the United States, where there's been a lot of criticism of Chinese students and some suspicion that they're doing things that are illegal or that even amount to espionage. So I think Chinese students are just much more careful these days. But in terms of affluence and fancy cars, I still think that we still see quite a lot of that, which perhaps is another indication of what Yun says, which is that the corruption, the anti-corruption campaign has made people hide their wealth, but it hasn't really eradicated the corruption itself. The Chinese system, I think, encourages corruption because the government and the business are so intertwined. It's actually very difficult not to be corrupt in order to get business done. So it's kind of an unfair system if the system sort of favors corruption and then punishes people for it as well.
All right. Well, I think we've really explored a lot of different issues here tonight, and this has been wonderful. Mary and Yun, thank you so much for your input and expertise. And with that, I'll turn it over to Betty, who will kind of bid us farewell.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. Thank you. I think we really did cover a very wide spectrum of just, I had a friend who was from mainland in China, and I haven't seen her for a while, maybe even since COVID, but we used to have lunch quite often, and she appreciated having lunch. She felt that a lot of the people that she was working with, that this was an IUPUI in Indianapolis, didn't shun her, but weren't real comfortable around her. And she just enjoyed the conversation. And she would, often say the same thing. She said, if you're intent not on getting in trouble, it could be just fine. You'll be fine. But I also heard the same thing in Egypt, an authoritarian society where cars are frequently pulled over and the boots opened up to kind of check out. And the person we were sort of spending some time with driving us around said, I never keep anything in my boot. So if I ever get pulled over, there's nothing and I'm on my way. But he said, I just try to keep my head down. But that if you want to be political, if you're outspoken, of course, then that's where it's going to get noticed. But very interesting across the spectrum. We covered so much tonight. Thank you so much. I really loved this format as well, where the both of you were sharing a very open conversation back and forth. You both brought such expertise and such authority, and you've spent so much time in China that you're speaking from a reality that is just fascinating. And I can tell from the reaction of those attending that it's been very well appreciated. And I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us, because I know that you're very busy. You are, Mary, in particular, getting close to the end of a school year, and there's a lot of things going on and a lot of pressure related to that. And I know that you're from your travels, you must be constantly meeting one deadline after the other. So thank you both very much. Please join us next week as
Thank you.
On Monday, the 6th of April, we will have the ambassador from Moldova, who is going to be in Indianapolis, and the Indiana Council of World Affairs was asked to please assist in a big way with various activities that the ambassador is going to be doing. We'll be having a forum with the ambassador Monday evening. And please remind me again, Janet or Ray, is that in the Fishers Library?
Yes, the Fishers Public Library.
Okay, we have sent out extensive notices about this.
Yeah.
And
it begins at 5 o'clock.
Starts at 5 o'clock. And then for those of you who might be interested, to please come to dinner with us afterward, which I think the ambassador will be joining us, so that we can have an informal conversation. And that is always tremendous fun. So for those of you who have missed our in-person meetings, this is a great opportunity to join us. And then on April the 14th, we will have one remaining program for the Great Decision Series that you remember. We were going to have this on multilateralism. And is there a shift in the world order going on? Frank O'Donnell was in Azerbaijan, detained because of the drone strikes, could not get out, but he is now back in Vienna and looking forward to joining us on April the 14th for that discussion. And who knows what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks? So much is happening right now. And yes, it is. The news is just popcorn right now, so it's hard to keep up. We will talk later. Of course, we have one more program for the Global Speaker Series. That will be the 1st of May, and that will be on renewable energy. And that'll be kind of interesting too, because discussions have come up about, so there's so much discussion about the price of oil because of the straits and being held hostage with it. Is this the time to start talking about deep, serious conversations about renewable energy, that we are less oil dependent? And of course, the concern of, are we losing lives over oil? And that will take us right into May, the end of our program year, our official program year for ICWA. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful to have you with us. And it's just a great program. And again, very, very deep thanks to Mary and to Yun for giving us your time. The discussion did not lag. It was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes, bye-bye.